I don't know whether you think about Lent very much or if you've done anything this year about it. I was listening to the radio, and it's quite interesting the way that it's still sort of out there in the public sort of psyche, in the public consciousness, because they were talking about what people are going to give up for Lent, and it's obviously still sort of seen a little bit as a time when you give something up. But I don't know if a lot of people know why they're doing that or where that thinking first came from. I like this little picture that a friend of mine put out on Facebook about giving up M&Ms so that it helps you get closer to God, which I thought was, which I found quite entertaining. I don't ever give up anything for Lent, really, not now. I don't know if I ever did. I probably tried. Chocolate comes to mind. But I have been trying to think this year a little bit more about what the original story is all about, really. Because the period of Lent is supposed to be about the time when Jesus went into the wilderness, which is a weird thing anyway. Because what happens is Jesus goes and gets baptised publicly in the Jordan River, not in a church or anything. It happens with his cousin John the Baptist. And then immediately he goes away from the crowds and the action and the noise, and he takes 40 days in the wilderness. And during that time we're told that he doesn't eat anything. So I think that's where the whole "what are you going to give up for Lent" comes from. But I was listening to a bishop on the radio, Nick Baines, and he was saying about, he thinks Lent is really about the time when Jesus went to face himself in the wilderness. So one of the reasons for pushing everything else away, the action and the lights and the fame that was starting to come his way, and the food as well actually, was to let everything fall away so that he could be sure who he was and have faced, if you like, his demons and all the stuff that was going to come at him in the future, and get it sorted out there and then, so that when he started to go out and be far more public, he would have dealt with a lot of that already. And I wonder if there's not a lot of wisdom in that when you look at celebrities, especially celebrity nowadays, which is thrust on people quite often, and they haven't had any preparation for it. And time and again, of course, we hear the stories of people ending up in rehab or falling apart with drink or marriages splitting up, and they're just not prepared for everything that life has thrown at them. And for Jesus, this was a time when he did prepare. He got his priorities sorted out. Another reason for him going into the desert is he's an Israelite, and so his history is tied up with a people who had to cross the desert, and that desert was supposed to be a time when they would get to know their God. In fact, things went wrong, and it wasn't great in that sense. But that was the idea, that they would come through this kind of tough time, and it would help them grow in their trust and dependency on God. And I think a lot of people would say today, when they've been through tough times, for some people it's really helped them to grow in their faith. So what Jesus does is he goes deliberately into a desert, into a wilderness, and his ancestors have spent 40 years crossing the desert. So he kind of echoes that by spending these 40 days. And we're told that he is tempted about 3 specific things, and those 3 things have echoes about them of what his ancestors struggled with in the desert. So the first very specific thing is bread. He's tempted, rather than fasting, rather than pushing away, the food and the temptation to just satisfy himself, he's tempted to do some magic and turn the rocks into bread. And of course there's loads of rocks in the desert, so I guess everywhere he went in this wilderness he was seeing all these stones and rocks, and he was tempted to turn them into food. Now, in the wilderness, when the Israelites were crossing it, they didn't have any food, and so God gave them what is called manna. It's a bit of a joke, really, because manna means "what is it?" So when it fell from the sky, they said, "What is it?" And that's what it became. What is it? Manna. And there was this sort of magic bread. And here's Jesus in the wilderness, facing up to that temptation, but actually denying himself. it's also tied up with the fact of Jesus wouldn't do miracles just to please people. Time and again he's asked to do that, and I think people forget that today. They go looking for Jesus so that he'll do the magic for them, but actually time and again people came to Jesus and said, do a miracle, prove yourself to us, or just give us what we want, and Jesus refused to do it. And it began in the wilderness when he refused to turn rocks into bread. Another temptation that he faces in the wilderness is to go up to the top of the temple, to throw himself off the highest point. And there was a promise in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Scriptures, that the angels would catch him if he did that. So he goes up to the highest part of the temple, and there he's tempted to throw himself down and trust that angels will catch him. And it's that whole thing about testing God, which in the desert, when the Israelites were crossing it for 40 years, they tested God in lots of ways, really. And they kept, demanding their own way. They kept saying, we want to go back home again. We want to go back to that place where we had to escape, in fact, because it was horrible, but they forget that it was horrible. And they put God to the test in all kinds of ways. Another thing about this temple experience of being thrown down and being caught is that that's how some people were executed for blasphemy, apparently. There's a guy called Nick Page who writes about this in his book The Wrong Messiah. And there are stories of people who had spoken against God, blasphemed. They were taken to the highest point of the temple, they were thrown down, and then they were, clubbed to death with rocks on the ground below. And here's Jesus going up to the highest point, being tempted to throw himself off, if you like, sacrifice himself almost, but to survive. Now what that's all to do with is, of course, Jesus is facing the very difficult situation about sacrificing himself, that ultimately he will give his life on the cross for the whole of the cosmos, the whole of the universe. And here he is being tempted to sacrifice himself and then escape at the last minute, be rescued by God. This kind of recurs when he's on the cross and is tempted to come down and save himself, or pray for angels to come and rescue him, all that kind of thing, really. So it's got echoes of that about it as well. The other temptation he faces is to worship the devil, and then he can have all the kingdoms of the world. That's the promise he's given. And of course that's idolatry, which the Israelites, again, in the desert, they, experience that big time. There's the great comedy moment in the Bible where Moses goes up this mountain to meet with God. When he comes down the mountain, what he discovers is the people, while he's been away, they've lost faith, they've got confused, they've looked to the wrong kind of leaders, if you like, or asked the wrong things of their leaders. Basically, they want something to worship. They're like a lot of us, really. We don't like invisible gods. We don't like this kind of, the faith that we have to put in this God that we cannot see. So they want something they can see. So they ask Moses' brother Aaron if he will make a statue for them. So he produces a golden calf. Now when Moses comes down and says, what's going on? Where did that come from? Aaron comes up with a great line out of panic, really. He says, I've no idea. I just threw some earrings in the fire and the golden calf came out. And Moses is like, yeah, right. And that turns into a very bad situation. But the people worship it, you see. They worship the calf, which I think had echoes about the worship that was going on in Egypt. So from the pagan situation they'd come from. And here's Jesus being tempted to worship the wrong things, as we often do it, don't we? Whether we, out and out think of it as idolatry, or whether we just put our energy and our money and our heart into things that are destructive, that kind of thing, or that distract us from the things of God. In the film The Last Temptation of Christ by Martin Scorsese, I really like the temptation scenes in that, because it sort of fleshes it out a bit, and there are more temptations as well going on there. Jesus faces the temptation, for example, to be with a woman, to sleep with a woman. He faces temptations to give up his calling. The question being, why are you doing this? What are you doing here? What difference are you going to make? It comes at Jesus in all kinds of ways, and I can't help thinking there's probably a lot of truth in this, because I think Jesus faced all kinds of temptations, and probably not just in that wilderness. He faced temptations probably every day of his life as we face temptations. And perhaps that intensified when he went out on his 3-year mission, when he was actually teaching people, telling stories and jokes, and doing miracles and healing people, and ultimately sacrificing himself and serving people. I'm sure there were massive temptations during that time, really. And I like all that that's kind of embodied in that scene in The Last Temptation. And there's a little bit in one of the books in the Bible, which is called the Letter to the Hebrews. And it's in chapter 4, I think it's something like verse 14, 15, 16. And it's tucked away there, but I love it because it says, Jesus understands what life is like for us because he has faced all the temptations that we face. And I guess all of that is going on as well with this kind of Lent experience, that Jesus is facing up to himself, he's facing temptations and demons, and he's experiencing what ordinary people now experience. And he's going through all that, that difficult time. And I think in The Last Temptation, at one point you see him break down, and he's crying there in the desert on his own. He's lonely and he's struggling with all this stuff. If ever there was a God who can understand what reality is like, it's Jesus. And I think that's part of what Lent is all about.